Richard Harris, who's at McMaster University, and he is a urban historical geographer. And his focus is on the history of housing, housing policy, suburban development, and within the Canadian context, but also globally, as I was hearing last night.
I will try to keep my comments fairly brief so that we have some chance to have some sort of a discussion, hopefully. I do have a couple of pretty images to show you, not as many as many of the other people today, but I kept them at the end, so you have to stay awake, I'm afraid. I'm stepping back in a different sort of a way. I'm actually, officially, I'm the geographer. I'm trained as the geographer, and I'm not really going to be giving you much of a geographical perspective, much more of a historical perspective. And I'm going to be arguing, and it's somewhat speculative, but I'm going to be arguing that neighborhoods actually now matter more than they did 100 years ago. And I'm going to spell out and skip over quite quickly a number of reasons. I've got to cover a fair amount of territory, so bear with me. Okay. Prefatory comments, it says. Yes, I'm talking about, to some extent, the neighborhood effect, and many of you in this room, I think, are very familiar with that concept. It's been touched on several times today, and I think last night too. But what I'm also talking about is neighborhood sorting and neighborhood choice. It's a little bit along the lines of what Robert Sampson, in his recent book on Chicago, he speaks about. He refers to selection bias as including selection bias as being part of the neighborhood effect. In other words, it's not just once you've moved into a neighborhood, what effect does that have on you? It's also neighborhoods differ in part because of the choices that people make, and the choices people make are based in part on what's available, all of the above. As I was putting this together, I couldn't quite decide whether what I was saying was original, obvious, or wrong. And you, no doubt every one of you will have some thoughts about that. But I was somewhat reassured, well, disconcerted and reassured, when I read only last week this piece by Claude Fisher, which is, if you base it on citation analyses, a rather neglected piece of work, but very interesting, where he anticipates, or I guess I should say he said first, a number of things that I wanted to say, but I'm going to be, I disagree with him in some ways, and I'm adding to it as well to justify myself, but a very interesting piece which I suggest you look at if you're interested in what I'm speaking about today. And what I am speaking about today is it's sort of a mix of facts or things that I think we can pretty well take to be factual, truth, reality, and also speculation. And the bits that I've put in italics, that's the more speculative stuff. So first of all, let's clear away why, in some respects, I think it's fairly safe to say that neighborhoods matter less than they used to. And I'm covering some familiar sorts of arguments here, so I'm not going to go on about it, just indicate that, yes, I'm aware of this, and that's part of the argument. Basic public services, at least some of them, the piped water and sewers and this kind of stuff, you couldn't take that for granted in late 19th century Newark or wherever, Chicago. There were lots of areas that didn't have some of that stuff today. You can take it for granted even in Detroit, maybe. More standardization in that sense. Yes, we know, and it's important, that everyday mobility has increased. Work, shopping, leisure, the impact of the streetcar, the automobile, very familiar sorts of stuff. Familiar because it's important. And also, in more recent decades, the rising labor force participation of women, which of course means that women spend proportionately less of their time in neighborhoods with the eyes on the street, and all of the stuff that Jane Jacobs has taught us to think about. And partly as a result of that, but also due to other kinds of considerations, our cognitive worlds are larger than the cognitive worlds of people who lived probably in any sort of a neighborhood, any sort of an area 100 years ago. We travel much more, not just on a daily basis, but obviously for vacations and conferences such as this. Mass communication, of course, newspapers, TV, internet, etc. We have information, overloads of information, but from all over the place. And also two-way communication, which we were hearing about from Luke, the social media and so on. This is, I think, familiar stuff. And all of this, I think it's pretty reasonable to say, as a matter of fact, that all of this stuff has made neighborhoods matter less, at least in some respects. And the consequence of that is the erosion of the neighborhood community. Let's put it that way. Neighborhoods differ little in terms of the basic physical infrastructure. I'm kind of recapitulating. People spend less time there. Informal neighboring has declined, and there is actual hard evidence for that in recent decades. But I'm talking about very specifically informal neighboring, that is to say among neighbors, people who live close to each other. And also people are aware of and knowledgeable about conditions elsewhere. I think that's pretty reasonable to say. So why am I arguing? Why am I arguing the opposite, that neighborhoods matter more? Well, two big reasons. I mean, there's a lot, I think, that could be said, but I want to focus on two big things. Number one, if we're thinking about what happens intergenerationally, whether it's social mobility or no social mobility, schools, local schools, have come to matter more and more. Most people in the United States, most children, I should say, attend the local public school. In 2007, 89% went to a public school, 73% went to an assigned public school, which means local, basically. In Canada, the percentage is 95%. And yes, I am looking at things in part as a Canadian and implicitly making comparisons, and I've thrown in some Canadian stats just for your interest. In combination, school quality and, of course, peers within the school, within the neighborhood, have a substantial impact on educational achievement. I don't think that's pretty well established. So how do we think about this historically? Well, the incidence of secondary education, of course, over the past century or so has risen. Graduation rates in 1910 were 9% from high school. The big change actually came in the 20s and the 30s. By 1940, it was 52%. Well, you can see the numbers there. So the importance, I mean, that's only one measure, of course, of the importance of high schools has risen. And arguably, and this is where I put it in a more speculative kind of a vein, the significance of those high school education has risen because, or it's been underlined by a decline in family size, and which raises the value, quote unquote, of each child because there's so many fewer of them. Fisher actually argues the opposite, so you could debate that, I suppose. The second issue, and here I think it's even, I think the argument is even stronger that over time neighborhoods, or at least place of residence, let's put it that way, has become more important, is the rise in urban home ownership. We know it's very well established, all sorts of contexts, that owners have a greater, because they have a twofold stake in their neighborhood of residence. It's both a use value, a place that they need to live, value as a social setting, but also, of course, it's, in most of our cases, it's the largest investment that we have. It's very important financially. Owners move less often than tenants always have, for all sorts of obvious reasons. Owners are more attached to their neighborhood. They're more likely to join neighborhood associations, and NIMBYism is very much a property-owning phenomenon. We know this. It's fact, and it always has been. Historically, well, look at those numbers. 100 years ago, or a little bit more than 100 years ago, roughly speaking, well, in fact, according to the census, almost exactly 1/3 of all people living in non-farm areas or property, 1/3 owned, 2/3 were tenants. Today, they're almost exactly the reverse, which means that the average neighborhood, such as we were looking at just now in John Logan's presentation, the average neighborhood would have been a neighborhood of tenants. Today, the average neighborhood is a neighborhood of property owners, and I think that's a hugely important thing. In Canada, incidentally, the change over the same period of time, very much obviously the same trend, but just larger, because the proportion in 1900 was lower, and the proportion today is slightly higher, so there. Sorry about that. It was in the 1920s, I mean, historians know this, many people don't, I don't think. It was in the 1920s that home ownership became the norm for the middle class. It was a working class and immigrant thing, but it was in the 1920s that the middle class decided, or were persuaded, that this was critical. And you can really see this very clearly in the advice manuals that were written and published in that period. And I could go on ad infinitum about that, because I've looked at them really closely. So that's, I think, a very significant source. Aha. There we go. It was also in the 1920s that we see the rise of those privately planned subdivisions. A couple of times already people have referred to Clarence Perry. I think Ken Jackson did yesterday. And Perry's neighborhood unit, of course, is mentioned again and again and again. In the late 1920s, Perry observed, and I think accurately, that really his neighborhood unit idea was very much already being implemented, and you could say it was almost being developed as much as anything else by land developers who were creating middle-class suburban subdivisions with that kind of neighborhood unit concept in mind. And of course, these were for property-owning homeowners. So I'm trying to give you a sense not just of the rise of home ownership, but also the changing meaning of it over time. 1930s, Ken Jackson also mentioned the redlining, the role of the FHA, and so forth. Very familiar, but also very important in linking the whole idea of risk, the risk associated with investments, with the character of the neighborhood. Something that lenders, anyone associated with the real estate industry, became, or was already, in fact, by the 1930s, very aware of. So we're getting the rise then of the neighborhood as a real estate product, but in people's minds as a real estate product. From the 1960s, of course, we've seen the rise of gated communities, the rise of common interest developments, I suppose is the broadest category there, with their homeowner associations. And so what I would argue is that, and there's no magic date to this, but let's say the post-war period, that investment has become progressively more prominent as a reason for purchase. I mean, obviously people in the 1920s, when they were buying, were not unaware of the role of the home as an investment, but I think it has become progressively, relatively more important, and everyone is very aware of that, and it's very dependent on the neighborhood, which is, part of, as I say, the argument that I'm making. So the long-term consequences then, rates of residential mobility have declined because more people are homeowners move less often, it sort of follows. From rates in the late 19th century of 30% per annum to today, it's 20% or in fact slightly less. I mean, everyone always says Americans, and that includes Canadians too, are very mobile people, and that is true, but we're less mobile now than we were 30 years ago, or certainly 100 years ago. Also, and linking back to what I was saying before, in terms of children's education, but then also of their personal savings, parents now have a greater stake in their neighborhood of residence than ever before. That's really the bottom line. But going with that, and this is just as important, and it's something that's been touched on by a number of people both today and also by Ken Jackson in his talk last night, when he referred to neighborhoods as discursive things. I mean, people are aware of this. People know this. George Galster earlier was talking about how it's very important to know the position of the neighborhood in relation to other neighborhoods or areas within the city. People are very acutely aware of this in a way which I don't think would have been true 100 years ago for the reasons that I've just been talking about. Okay, I do have a couple of pictures for you. I've suggested sort of a long-run trend and haven't done much in the way of suggesting ups and downs. Well, there is, I think, a major cyclical element, and that has to do with the neighborhoods of the poor, which we were hearing about earlier today. One of the things that I've done as part of a project that I'm involved in Canada is to look at newspaper coverage of neighborhoods, which it's possible to do, or when I say newspaper coverage of neighborhoods, I mean of the idea of neighborhood, references to neighborhood, quote unquote. And it's possible to do this in the New York Times, but also in the Toronto Globe and Mail. And as you can see, and I'm not going to go into the details here, but obviously there's been a very dramatic increase in recent years in references to neighborhood. But there was also a bit of a peak in the early 20th century, around the time of the settlement houses, which obviously were, you know, those middle-class reformers moving into or going into immigrant neighborhoods and trying to, concerned about citizenship and conditions and so on and so forth. There's obvious parallels, there's differences I know, but there's obvious parallels too with the increasing, growing concern with concentrated poverty in recent years. In case you're wondering why I've got what it means by standardized on both of those charts means standardized in relation to the number of, to the length of the full text in each of those years, because obviously the more articles are published, or the longer the articles that are published in a given year, the more references you're going to have to anything, including neighborhood. So I've standardized it. Well, doesn't that double peak, U-shaped, whatever you want to call it, pattern in terms of mentions of neighborhood in the newspapers, doesn't it correlate with what I assume is a rather familiar graph to most of us, the overall trends in terms of income inequality, which of course were high in the early 20th century and fell, and then have risen again recently. And it's sort of a no-brainer that if you have rising income inequality, you're likely to have increasing disparity in terms of neighborhoods. And I don't know how many of you have seen this series of maps which Janet Smith produced, I think quite recently. It shows, in a nutshell, it shows the steady decline in the number of middle-income neighborhoods in the city of Chicago over the last 40 years. Middle, that is to say, sort of straddling the median income. I'm also very familiar with very much the same pattern which David Holchansky has shown for Toronto, which is a city I'm much more familiar with, which, if anything, I think is even more striking in terms of the polarization of neighborhoods over pretty much the same period of time. I mean, David Holchansky is heading up a project which is looking at Canadian cities as a whole, and very much the same pattern. Toronto's a bit more dramatic than most, but very much the same pattern can be seen elsewhere. So what you're getting then is this polarization, and I would suggest that it's a polarization that has parallels with the way that cities were 100 years ago. So this is a cyclical element, and it's of particular importance to lower income households. So just really to summarize, I guess, neighborhoods, I think, are less important as a source of social community, and there's, I mean, endless discussions about the loss of community, quote unquote, on the assumption that community equaled neighborhood, which I don't think it necessarily does at all. But I've tried to suggest that neighborhoods are and are understood to be, and that's a key thing. People know it, feel it, act on that basis, that they're more important as vehicles for reproducing or enhancing class position, and also as real estate investments, speculative or otherwise. And then, yeah, just to underline the point that I just made, that neighborhoods have renewed importance for the urban poor, and maybe more so even than ever, maybe even more so than 100 years ago. Thank you.